Hello, everybody. Welcome to this very special British Museum online event on decipherment and the birth of Egyptology. My name is Dr. Chris Naunton. I'm an Egyptologist with a particular interest in the history of Egyptology, and it's my very great pleasure and privilege, it's an honor indeed, to be chairing this discussion session today. We are going to be looking at questions such as how did Egyptology start, and how, when and why have early perceptions of ancient Egypt changed? We have a panel of extremely distinguished speakers for you. Dr. Okasha Daly of Qatar University Press, Dr. Patricia Usick of the Department of Egypt and Sudan at the British Museum. And we have, unfortunately, to start with an apology. We were due this evening to have with us Professor Ola Alagozi, Emeritus Professor of the University of Cairo. Unfortunately, Professor Alagozi has been taken ill today and won't be able to join us. But I have no doubt that between our other speakers, myself and you, the audience, we will nonetheless have an excellent discussion today. We are running to a fairly tight schedule, actually. So my intro ends here. I'm going to go straight in and introduce our first speaker. So Dr. Okasha Daly is an expert in the history of Egyptology, and in particular medieval Arab manuscripts and Egyptology as it is manifest in those documents. I've known Okasha myself for almost 20 years now. He was a trustee of the Egypt Exploration Society, where I worked for many years. And he made many very, very important contributions to the life of the ES in that time, as well as writing a PhD thesis at UCL on the subject of his presentation this evening, which has made a tremendous impact on Egyptology and the history of our subject. I'm delighted he's able to join us today, apparently from Saqqara, although I suspect that that may be a false background. Anyway, Okasha is going to be speaking to us this evening on the subject of Arabic Egyptomania, how medieval Arab scholars rediscovered ancient Egypt. So over to you, Okasha.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Chris, and thank you very much, Hilary, and all your colleagues at the British Museum. It's been wonderful. My talk is actually intentionally entitled with the word Egyptomania, because this is a word that is so familiar to all of us here in the West, where everybody's brought up with some sort of fascination and passion for ancient Egypt. For the next slide, we should be able to see the very first book that fired Egyptomania here in the modern Egyptomania in the West. And Simon, our colleague, might help us pushing the slide forward. This book was actually written by an Egyptian in the 10th century in Arabic. It's a collection of descriptions of ancient Egyptian materials. We've got to remember that we have not many records in our current Egyptological materials in terms of history of Egyptology that refer to any medieval Arab contributions, unfortunately. And there are various reasons for that. We don't have time to go through them now. But one of them is most of modern Egyptology is owed to Champollion and the decipherment of hieroglyphic and his famous book on Egyptian grammar, which set the foundation for our modern studies, presumably all Western in origin. And actually, even today, as you probably know, most people involved in Egyptological studies are actually non-Egyptian, which in many ways, it's an excellent thing. It just shows the interest in ancient Egypt and how very common is it. And we're very grateful to all our colleagues in the West for contributing to the understanding of ancient Egypt. However, in modern Egyptology, not many people are aware that this very first book was actually a translation from an Arabic book, probably found its way through to France during the Crusader Wars. And this book was translated by the Prime Minister of France and published in Paris in 1666, as you can see from the date on the bottom, and translated actually shortly afterwards into English and published in London in 1672. And as I said, it's a collection of descriptions of ancient Egyptian sites, pyramids, inventions of ancient Egypt, collected by a religious authority man, probably an imam of the mosque in Amr ibn al-As mosque or something like this in medieval Cairo, collected for his own use. He was not probably the author. The man, his name is mentioned, Murtada, on the book, Murtada, son of Afifi or Ghafifi. That man collected all this from various books for his own interest in ancient Egypt. Obviously, many such scholars would have developed interest in the history of ancient Egypt, or description of its monuments. It was very common in 10, 11, 12th century Egypt. The people of that educational background will take interest in the history of ancient Egypt. And as we can see from the next slide, this is another landmark book translated also from Arabic, a very well-known authority on alchemy and agriculture, an Iraqi scholar called Ibn Wahshiyah, who visited Egypt in the 10th century, early 10th century CE, and he wrote books on alchemy, agriculture, poisons, and being an alchemist, he lived in an age where any serious alchemist was told to visit Egypt in search for its sacred knowledge on alchemy. Alchemy is basically started as a science of how to transfer basic cheap metals into gold. And it has some spiritual dimension as well, how to improve your own self and make of yourself a better and a higher human being. And Ibn Wahshiyah wrote this very well-known book on the decipherment of about 90 or more ancient scripts, including, of course, hieroglyphic. And this book was found by Joseph Hammer, a famous and well-known Austrian Orientalist, who translated it from Arabic into English and published it in London in 1806, as you can see from the bottom date. Now, this is a very significant date because this book has some very serious implications for the history of the decipherment process, as I will come back to this in a minute. So you can see two of the landmarks of Egyptology, as it were, actually were Arabic books translated into French and English. The next slide. This is from the introduction of Joseph Hammer to this translation in English of Ibn Wahshiyah's Arabic book. I used, by the way, a copy of that manuscript from the one in Paris in the Bibliothèque Nationale. And from the translation of Joseph Hammer, please read very carefully what he says here in the introduction. He was well aware that the French savants who accompanied Napoleon's expedition to Egypt were looking specifically for Oriental books to help them with the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphic. And this particular copy probably escaped their attention, according to Hammer. In fact, this book was in extant, must have been one of these popular sellers. Joseph Hammer had his own copy. I used a copy in Paris. There are about 3 or 4 more copies worldwide. And Ibn Wahshiyah was a very well-known alchemist anyway, so his books would have been very popular. Now, what is so special about this book? I'll come back to this when I discuss the decipherment itself in a few minutes. Next slide, please. It was very popular not only in Egypt, this interest in Egyptian text and Egyptian materials, but in Siena, this famous cathedral in Italy, I myself saw this beautiful painting of the Egyptian Hermes, introducing law to Europe according to the Latin text here on the stela on which he's resting his left hand. But please notice the Arabic garment of the dresses of both Hermes and his guests. So it was very popular in medieval times, both in Egypt and outside, to accredit Egyptian, whether they were ancient Egyptian scientists or ancient Egyptian deities like Hermes, who, as you all know, of course, is the Egyptian god Tot. Very popular, by the way, in Egyptian and Arabic medieval stories. The Arabs knew 3 different Hermeses. 2 of them are Egyptian. The one in the middle is from Iraq or Mesopotamia. The Egyptian one was credited with teaching the whole world writing, how to, do all sorts of things in terms of crafts, and was in a charge of, as a patron of science, knowledge, etc., etc. This is how medieval Arab scholars viewed ancient Egypt and in particular Hermes. On the next slide, well, one of the earlier books on ancient Egyptian archaeology is this famous book of Al-Idrisi. This is not the famous Al-Idrisi of North Africa who wrote in geography. This is an Egyptian one from Edfu, who was a great authority on hadith and jurisdiction of Islam. And he, like his father, were very interested in the subject of ancient Egypt. And his book, he died 1251. He came from Edfu and lived in Cairo. And shortly before his death, he was asked to write a book on the pyramids for the benefit of the ambassador of the German ambassador. The German emperor sent an ambassador to the Egyptian court, and the Egyptian court wanted to impress him by showing him the pyramids. And for that, they asked Al-Idrisi to write a book on the subject of the pyramids. And Al-Idrisi said, well, there are so many books on the subject. Why do you want me to write a new one? And they said, the books are quite extensive and large, and the ambassador doesn't have that sort of time. We want a summary. And that summary is a huge 7-chapter on the subject of the pyramid, the earliest scientific study on the subject of the Egyptian pyramids. The title itself is quite amazing. It links the pyramids to celestial bodies above our heads in the sky. And inside the book, he explained that ancient Egyptians built their pyramids in particular locations, taking into consideration the location of the stars or certain stars, something that we are now well aware of in astroarchaeology. But he also said 2 revolutionary ideas in this book. In the next slide, you will see one of those 2 revolutionary ideas. He was answering the criticism leveled at Quran that it does not mention the pyramids, in spite of the fact that Quran has 15 different verses that kind of encourage Muslims to look around, study history, study heritage, take interest in their own past, by the way of learning from the mistakes of previous cultures and do better. But his answer to this criticism is fantastic. He says, well, please remember that these holy books are not meant to teach you about history or the future. They are meant to put you on the straight face and improve your morality and help you lead a better moral life. And I think this is a revolutionary idea when we think of how we now view holy books and the relationship of holy books to archaeology. The next slide will show you some of that interest of medieval Arab scholars, or extensive interest. They went into the pyramids, tombs, temples, and they copied them. Sometimes they even had maps left of these sites. Here is a beautiful one from the 10th or 11th century manuscript now in the Ashmolean Library in Oxford, and says on the description of the temple of Akhmim, and the artist or the writer of this book showed an ancient Egyptian priest burning incense under a ceiling or a zodiac dome with the Egyptian zodiac signs. The next slide, and many of these medieval scholars, by the way, will have regular meetings. This one is from Ibn Umayl, a famous Egyptian alchemist of the 10th century, and he's obviously talking about regular meetings of a certain circle that took interest in the study of ancient Egyptian stela and see the relationship of what they see on the stela and their own discipline in alchemy. And in the next slide, we will see that the interest in Egyptian hieroglyphic and Egyptian material was not just limited to Egypt. Wherever Egyptian influence, cultural influence, or military influence went, with it went Egyptian hieroglyphic. And even when Egypt was conquered, like in this case by the great Dara I, of the Persian king in the 5th century BC, when he left Egypt, he took Egypt in his heart back with him home. We found the statue in Susa, and it's now in the National Museum in Tehran. It shows King Dara the Great, or Dara I, standing in his typical Persian garment on an Egyptian pedestal with beautiful typical hieroglyphic. And the close-up on the next slide will reveal a marvel thing. On that garment, a text written in 4 different scripts: Elamite, Old Persian, Akkadians, and of course Egyptian hieroglyphic. Now have a closer look in the next slide. You will see on the belt of the king around his waist, the slide to the right shows the names of the king and his titles in Egyptian hieroglyphic, just like a typical Egyptian pharaoh. I also like to draw attention to the beautiful artwork, which was actually inspired by ancient Egyptian minimum art, and you'll see that in the famous Tutankhamun, for example, famous closed books. In the next slide, so hieroglyphic was well known outside Egypt. Now, if we come back to the question of decipherment of Egyptian language, as part of the general interest of Egyptian scholars and Arab scholars, by the way, first of all, we start from two very important issues. Ibn Fatik in the 10th century, a very well-known Arab writer, made it very clear that Egyptian knew three different scripts: hieroglyphic, he mentioned them, hieroglyphic, hieratic, and demotic. Furthermore, he made the connection between ancient Egyptian language and Coptic of his day. He said the first one he called Al-Qibtiyya al-Ula, the first Coptic, and Coptic of his day he called Al-Qibtiyya al-Thaniya, second Coptic, making it very clear that Coptic was linked to ancient Egyptian. So it is not that Athanasius Kircher was the first scholar who came with that idea. He probably the first scholar who came with that idea, but about 40 different Arab writers were well known to Kircher, and he used them actually and quoted from them in Arabic in his own famous books in Latin. And I've seen those myself when I was doing my own studies. So the idea of the connection between ancient Egyptian language and Coptic was already well established in this medieval Arabic material. The second revolutionary idea was that these hieroglyphic signs are not just pictures, as widely known in the West, but they have alphabet letters with phonetic value, and they set out to give us some of these phonetic value. Whether they got it right or not, that's beside the point. They got several letters correct, but the important issue here is that they were aware that this is not just pictures, but it does have an alphabet like any language with its phonetic value. This is a famous unique manuscript in Turkey of the Nun al-Misri, an Egyptian Sufi and alchemist, was brought up in the temple of Akhmim in Upper Egypt, which was a great city and well-known center of learning, and the city of Dosimus, of course, the famous Greek alchemist, or Egyptian alchemist who wrote in Greek, to be more precise. And here we have the Nun brought up in that very same city and well aware of its history and well aware of the hieroglyphic around him in the temple. And he taught himself Coptic and he taught himself hieroglyphic, widely said of him. And this manuscript shows that he really did. If you can bring the next slide, you will see the Coptic of his own manuscript is correctly written in his. This is not his own handwriting, by the way. Remember, these manuscripts were copied and copied and copied, probably fourth or fifth generations away from him, because he was very popular. And we still recognize his Coptic are correctly written in terms of the shape of form of the letters and in terms of their phonetic value as well. In the next slide, he did mention names of hieroglyphic, they called them Temple of Barabi script, but he mentioned this top right square. He mentioned a script ascribed to Jabir ibn Hayyan, and Jabir is a famous alchemist from the Baghdad from the 8th century CE, and he came to Egypt, and he was well known as a linguist as well. He was interested in ancient languages, and he's widely reputed to have written a massive book on the decipherment of ancient languages, from which many later scholars were copying. And it may be that the Nun al-Misri had access to that book, like some of his later successors, and some of these letters I recognize as demotic, but I'm not 100% sure how far I can go with that. But I say it as Nun al-Misri was one of the earliest scholars in medieval Islam who established that link between Egyptian and the hieroglyphic letters and their phonetic value. If we take the next slide, we come to a great Ibn Ashir, the alchemist from Iraq, who too made it very clear that some of these are Egyptian alphabet with its own value. People disputed this argument. I'm not here to say he got everything correct. The very first letter, these are the letters on, as he said, according to the Egyptian, he called them Haramisa. followers of Hermes. The very first letter is correctly A, Aleph, in Greek-Roman period. That was used as an Aleph. But please remember that the temples accessible to medieval Arabs would have been mainly the temples of the Greek-Roman period, Dandara, Edfu, Akhmim, etc. And there is a second revolution Ibn Wahshiyya came up with. He was the first one to identify that some of these hieroglyphic, if we could see the next slide, some of these hieroglyphic are not pictures just or alphabet with phonetic value, but some of them were used as determinatives, and he specifically used this word, the determinatives, and he gave us a list of such determinatives or signifiers and their meaning as we know them in Egyptology. Here is just a list, and if you see on the next slide, I compared it to a great work of grammar that we all study, Egyptian grammar of Sir Alan Gardner, and I quoted from it in the bottom some of the Sir Alan Gardners to compare it to Ibn Wahshiyya and show you that Ibn Wahshiyya was actually well informed because many of his determinatives are correctly given the correct meanings. If we take the next slide, so I would like also to mention Abul Qasim al-Iraqi. This is the second Iraqi scholar. Iraqi scholars were very much fascinated by ancient Egypt, and he too was an alchemist. So you could see they were Sufis and alchemists who took great interest in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic. This is for a manuscript of him in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and he called it Kalam Birbawi, the temple pen or temple language. And you can see A, B, T are all correctly given, and 3 letters or probably 5 of this list are correctly given by Abul Qasim al-Iraqi, a great achievement in itself. On the next slide, I have to hurry up. Here is another picture of the manuscript of Abul Qasim al-Iraqi, where he gives hieroglyphic and their phonetic value. And on the next one, he did even us a great favor by simply preserving for us a stela that was lost to us in Egyptology of a very well-known king of the Middle Kingdom of the 12th dynasty called Nup-Ka-Ra, as you can see his name in the cartouche on the right of the stela, or Amenemhat II. We don't have many stela left of that particular king, and therefore we're very grateful that Abul Qasim al-Iraqi, the alchemist, preserved for us this stela. Now, again, for him as an alchemist, of course, he looks at every symbol here and gives it an alchemical meaning, but that's not the important thing here. The important thing is these medieval Arab scholars took great interest in ancient Egypt as the land of alchemy and sciences, and ascribed to ancient Egyptians so many inventions that sound too fantastical for us to believe. They thought that the ancient Egyptian had a central lighting system in the city, a dome that lit up the whole night for free, obviously. The whole city was lit up this way. They had automatic machines. They had automatic doors that open. They had speakers, statues that move and speak. And on the next slide, you'll see him as an alchemist, Abul Qasim al-Iraqi. This is from the same manuscript, which is kept in the British Library in London. He has the Egyptian famous snake that eats its tail as a sign of eternity or renovation of life. And he gives it the correct meaning. As you can see from the next slide, from the time of Tutankhamun, we have the same famous snake that eats its tail as by way of showing eternity and eternal life and renovation of life surrounding the young king Tutankhamun. And on the next slide, this is from Abul Qasim al-Iraqi's manuscript as well. He very clearly was well aware of Coptic, and he copied a Coptic icon correctly with the names of Gabriel to the right and Michael to the left, correctly written. The next slide. Why were medieval Arabs particularly interested in hieroglyphic? Well, as I said, Egypt was considered by them the land of the great science and sacred knowledge and wisdom, and they came seeking that sacred knowledge in its own land. So they visited Egypt, and many of them, like Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi, who was a great doctor, they came and studied Egyptian mummies by way of understanding the correct way of anatomy, and he even corrected some of the famous mistakes by Galen in terms of anatomy, etc., etc. So these attracted ancient Egypt, that is, attracted doctors, alchemists, but it also attracted Sufis for this beautiful hieroglyphic with its harmony. a special thing for the Sufis. Now it attracted one more type of people, those who are looking for codes or how to discover a secret script that can be used in military and diplomatic correspondence, and demotic particularly, and hieratic of course, as well as hieroglyphic, would have seemed a very attractive choice. So if you manage to use some of these scripts to design a language that can, or a script that can be used for military or diplomatic correspondence, that you can keep your own secrets from your adversaries, this would have been a great thing. And here is a good example of a medieval Arab scholar called Ibn Drahim on Hal al-Rumuz. This is for the how to find from the earlier ancient scripts on the temple walls, as it says here in Arabic, a code that would be very helpful. The next one. Now, I said medieval Arab scholars were interested in the science and knowledge of ancient Egypt and the wisdom, but they were also interested in its artwork. So many of these medieval Arab scholars and artists would have visited ancient Egyptian tombs. They would have seen the ceiling of these tombs. They would have seen ceiling of temples, and they derived some of the inspiration for what became very popular, known as Arabesque or Islamic art. The roots of some of that, like the roots of Sufism, by the way, were to be found in ancient Egypt. Sufism is a great tradition, normally accredited to Indians and Persian origins, but actually an ancient Egyptian origin should be considered as well in light of my own studies, especially as a Nun al-Misri, the scholar I mentioned earlier, the Sufis I mentioned earlier, he linked ancient Egyptian with Sufism. And here's just in my last two slides, I would like you to see some of the ancient Egyptian art and how it affected the Arabesque art.
To be over here.
Two slides more and then I'm finished, please. Yeah, here, these are all ancient, go ahead. These are ancient Egyptian artworks that became the inspiration for what we know now as Arabic or Islamic art. Next ones will just show you, this is from the famous Akhenaten's palace in Amarna, and it looks like an Arabic rug or a Persian rug to me. And the next one, and I think the next one is the last one. This is the famous Tutankhamun box, which is going to be shown in the Grand Museum in Cairo when it's open soon, among his collection. And you could see the artwork on this and on other pieces of Egyptian wooden work, a great source for what became later Persian, Islamic art, etc., etc. So all in all, ancient Egypt was for Arabs and medieval Egyptian and Arabs a great source of inspiration. And the idea of Egyptomania was very already rooted in that interest in ancient Egypt as the land of science, magic, and sacred knowledge. And so we owe a great deal to this 1,000 years of medieval Arabic scholarship to fill in the gap of our own knowledge in the discipline of the history of Egyptology. Currently, we teach it as, you know, as a European construct, and the last thing we know is the Greek-Roman world. Then 1,000 years of hiatus. There's not much on ancient Egypt, and then we pick it again with Kircher and other scholars, and that will be the subject of my colleague to talk about it in detail. I just wanted to fill in that gap of 1,000 years of history of Egyptology. And thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much, Chris, for putting up with me. And thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Okasha. Wonderful as always, absolutely fascinating. There can be, I think, no better response to our European Western bias of the idea of a kind of rediscovery of ancient Egypt that happens in the last 200 years, as if, as you say, you know, everything was just completely lost since Greco-Roman times. And there can be no better response to that than, even if you only had 20 minutes or so today, an expose of all of these medieval scholars and their works on ancient Egypt, on Egyptology. I can't resist mentioning Dr. Okasha's book, Egyptology, The Missing Millennium, which really is the place to go if you want to know more about this material and these scholars. And I can't, I think, overstate how important that book is to Egyptology and a critical approach to our subject. I loved your mention of a medieval scholar saying, why do we need any more books about pyramids? That just shows, doesn't it, that some things never change. I also loved your expose of that statue of Darius I, which is one of my favorite things. It's an absolutely wonderful piece and speaks to the kind of internationalism of the ancient world better than any object, I think. I think I remember rightly as well that was on display in the British Museum in the Persia exhibition a few years ago. Tremendous. Some of you in the audience will have seen that. I should have said at the very outset to everybody that I'm sure most of you know how these events work by now. If you have questions, you're welcome to post them at any time. But if you do that, you need to post them in the Q&A box. And the team behind the scenes will gather those up together, and the best of them will be forwarded to me. We'll take those at the end. So do feel free to post your questions, and we'll do our best to get through as many of those as we can. Without any further ado, I think we must move on to our second speaker. Dr. Patricia Usick is another extremely highly regarded, distinguished speaker. I can't think of anybody who has done more to bring to light the Egyptological archives of the Department of Egypt and Sudan at the British Museum. And this has led to a whole enormous and extremely important back catalogue of publications. A favourite of mine is Tricia's book on William John Banks, which is just an absolutely delightful study of his journey through Egypt, just about 200 years ago, Egypt and Nubia, I should say. Tricia is going to be talking to us today about the subject which is absolutely central to this great 200-year anniversary, all the celebrations around the decipherment, specifically the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. Patricia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that introduction. So, the understanding of hieroglyphs had been lost as the culture of ancient Egypt was overcome by waves of conquests and occupations. But, of course, as Okasha has shown, that didn't stop everybody trying. And the medieval period, I'm going to be speaking about a much later period, it's always mystified people, but everybody has wanted to find the key. So the last hieroglyphic inscription was written at the Temple of Philae in the 3rd century AD, part of a priestly writing system which had become deliberately complex and arcane and had been replaced for everyday use by a completely different script called Demotic. Hieroglyphs were seen as mystical symbols rather than a written language. In the 17th century, as Okasha mentioned, a Jesuit priest, Athanasius Kircher, proposed a decipherment, but based on fantastical and esoteric interpretations, although he recognized a link to the Coptic language of Christian Egypt. And just 2 years before the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, a Danish scholar in Rome, George Zoeger, published a history of the ancient Egyptian obelisks, which had been taken to Rome by Roman emperors. And with Zoeger's knowledge of Coptic, he made some progress on decipherment and certainly saw it as a language. And interestingly, he was using some copies of inscriptions made from him here by an English traveller in the British Museum, who was doing rubbings on the backs of the inscriptions of statues. So it should be absolutely accurate for Zoeger, who needed as many inscriptions as possible. But one of the problems was that they didn't have enough inscriptions to work on eventually until more travelers made accurate copies. So at the end of the 18th century, Europe was aware of the geographic and mercantile potential of Egypt and the weakness of the Ottoman Empire. The French Count Volney published an account of his travels in Egypt, which posited the benefits of a French invasion for both culture and trade. British interests in India were also at stake to secure the overland route through Egypt to India, where the British East India Company's troops were steadily establishing control. When Tipu Sultan of Mysore sought General Napoleon Bonaparte's help against the increasing threat of British power in India in December 1797, he received an encouraging response of French support. And in fact, in the margin of a book on Turkish warfare, Napoleon had written, "Through Egypt, we shall invade India." Fresh from his victories in Italy, but frustrated in attempts to invade England, Napoleon landed in Egypt on the 1st of July, 1798, with 40,000 troops. Egypt was then ruled by a coalition of two Mameluke leaders, Murad and Ibrahim Bey, who ruled Egypt under the nominal hegemony of a pasha in Cairo, installed by the Ottoman Sultan. Having taken Malta, Napoleon aimed to cut off the British from their lucrative overland trade with India, establish a French colony, and then supplant British power in India itself. His army was therefore accompanied by a commission of arts and sciences, staffed by the most brilliant minds of the day, who, in the spirit of the Enlightenment, would survey and map Egypt, ancient and modern. It comprised some 167 scholars known as the savants, military engineers, astronomers, botanists, mathematicians, geographers, and artists. Some established figures, others young students. In Cairo, they replicated the French Institute with an Institut d'Egypte, housed in a former palace, which you can see here, where they established a library, a printing press with Arabic, Syriac, and Greek fonts. I think they'd requisitioned that from the Vatican on one of the French raids. They held meetings there and they wrote papers. And as General Desaix chased the Mameluke army south, he was accompanied by the antiquary and artist Baron Dominique Vivant de Nantes, at 52, one of the most eminent savants. On his return to Paris with Napoleon, Denon would publish his travel journal and drawings of the great temple complexes of Upper Egypt to universal acclaim, and he was to become the first director of the Louvre Museum. In mid-July 1799, facing an impending attack from Ottoman naval forces to avenge Napoleon's campaign in Syria, the French strengthened their shore defenses. The castle fort at Rosetta, a green and fertile delta town on the western branch of the Nile, had been constructed by Sultan Cape Bey in the 15th century and was in a dilapidated state. Renamed Fort Julien after one of Napoleon's aides-de-camp who'd been killed in an attack, the fort commander instructed young Lieutenant PierreBouchon to organize the reconstruction of the outer defenses. A junior member of the commission, Bouchon had taken his final engineering examinations at the Cairo Institute, having previously served in the new aeronautic squadron of Nicolas Conté, which used hydrogen balloons for observation. They had both damaged an eye in an explosion during experiments with gas. And Conté was also the inventor of the pencil. Among the rubble of the foundations of the fort, the remains of an ancient stone stela appeared, seemingly of blackish granite, on which Bouchon recognized 3 fragmentary horizontal inscriptions: Egyptian hieroglyphs at the top, Greek, which could be read at the bottom, and between them an unknown script initially thought to be Syriac. Denon had noted the reuse of other inscribed blocks in the fort, and they probably came from the nearby ancient site of Sais. The Rosetta Stone is actually a priestly degree written in 196 BCE, honoring the king Ptolemy V. Realizing its potential significance to the decipherment of hieroglyphs, Bouchon took the stone to General Menu, who had the stone cleaned and the Greek partially translated. The Greek inscription confirmed that it was the same text in all 3 scripts. Bouchon and the stone sailed up the Nile to Cairo, where its discovery and arrival on the 19th of August 1799 were announced in the Commission's Gazette, the Courrier de l'Egypte, and this was the first mention of the stone being perhaps the key to the decipherment of hieroglyphs. And that same issue of the Gazette also announced the abrupt departure of Napoleon from Cairo for France. His military campaign, initially successful, had been, had been disrupted by the Battle of the Nile, Admiral Nelson's destruction of the French fleet, moored in Aboukir Bay near Alexandria, which left the French army cut off in Egypt. And following an unsuccessful campaign in Syria and local insurrection in Cairo, Napoleon had secretly arranged to return to Paris with Denon and some of his officers abandoning his army. And he had seen quite correctly where his future lay in Paris. Meanwhile, at Cairo, everyone ran to see the marvelous stone and spent weeks examining it in detail, hoping it would provide the key to the history and understanding of ancient Egypt. The first and indispensable condition being to make exact copies. Two young Orientalists, Louis-Rémy Rège and Jean-Joseph Marcel, had recognized that the middle inscription was not Syriac, but a cursive script of the Egyptian language, which they had seen on papyrus and mummy bandages. To copy it by hand could take months and contain errors. Therefore, some 10 years prior to the invention of lithography, they washed the stone, leaving water in the indentations, then covered the surface with ink and printed it onto thin sheets of damp-coated paper. They produced a white on black reverse copy, which could be read with a mirror or against the light. Meanwhile, Conte, independently, treated it like a copper engraving, producing a black on white image. Rège and Marcel began to translate the Greek, noting that it included many Egyptian proper names. The decree ordered the text to be engraved on hard stone in sacred, vernacular, and Greek characters, and to be placed in every Egyptian temple. The script and the language of the vernacular section were unknown. They thought it perhaps related to Coptic or some other ancient language. Using a pair of compasses, they searched mechanically for parallels in the proportional position of the proper names, starting with Ptolemy, and attempting to break down the sequence of signs. The engineer Raphaël Delisle also took a sulfur cast, which avoided any printing errors, and by that summer, printed copies of the inscription had been sent to France. Now, on the 8th of March, 1801, the British fleet landed at Aboukir Bay and the French were defeated at the Battle of Canopus, retreating to a siege of the walled city of Alexandria, where the savants joined them. General Sir John Healy Hutchinson commanded the British army, while Hussein Capudan Pasha, that is the High Admiral of the Turkish fleet, allied to the British, landed his troops at Aboukir. After Cairo surrendered, General Menou, now French commander-in-chief, surrendered Alexandria and signed the capitulation on the 31st of August, 1801, with the British and the Capudan Pasha. Menou's first proposal for Article 16 was that the French should keep all their papers, plans, memoirs, collections of natural history, and antiquities. Hutchinson refused and passed the arrangements on to two scholarly Englishmen. The antiquarian Reverend Edward Daniel Clarke had been traveling through Europe and Asia with his wealthy young student, John Martin Cripps. In Cairo, they met the like-minded William Richard Hamilton, private secretary to Lord Elgin, the British ambassador to Constantinople. Hamilton had been sent to Egypt to supervise the capitulation. They visited the pyramids together, always time for a bit of sightseeing, and Clarke was shown another scarcely legible trilingular stone in the French Institute. And that is the stone that's in the exhibition in the museum, called by a number of names. Hamilton revised Article 16 so that other than the savants' instruments of arts and sciences, all their collections, including, as Okasha had pointed out, Arabian manuscripts and statues and other collections which have been made for the French Republic, should be at the disposal of the generals of the British and Ottoman armies. The savants protested to Menu that this gave away a property of science and art, the holiest of all. They insisted that the collections were not only private property, but would perish by changing hands, becoming, like Egyptian, a dead language. When Hamilton still refused, the naturalist Saint-Hilaire exclaimed furiously that they would rather burn their treasures. For your fame, count on the remembrance of history. You too will have burned a library at Alexandria. Hamilton relented and agreed to plead their cause, and the savants would eventually return to France, where the materials would become their great and influential publication, the Description de l'Égypte, published between 1809 and 1828. Hutchinson wrote to Clark and Hamilton to recover all the antiquities, and in particular to safeguard the Rosetta Stone and to copy the inscription in case it should be damaged. He gave them a copy made with red chalk upon paper by a member of the Institute, and instructed Colonel Tompkins Hillgrove Turner of the Guards to oversee the recovery. They were shown the warehouses near the old port and were astounded by the number and quality of the antiques, some of colossal size. They scoured Alexandria for the other collections, finding statues, sarcophagi, maps, manuscripts, drawings, plans, charts, botany, stuffed birds, animals, dried fishes, etc. Clark and Hamilton rowed out to discover a sarcophagus said to be the tomb of Alexander the Great, which had been hidden in the hold of a hospital ship. Hamilton wrote, "This monument was resigned to us not without much regret, as it had long been considered one of the most valuable curiosities in Alexandria, but much greater reluctance was manifested by General Menu when the claim was made for the trilingular or Rosetta Stone, nor was it given up without frequent remonstrances on his part." Menu claimed the stone was as much his own property as the linen of his wardrobe or his embroidered saddles, and all the antiquities were listed as belonging to individual generals. Clark, Cripps, and Hamilton visited Menu at his tent to collect the stone. When the stone was mentioned, Menu gave vent to his rage. "You may tell your commander-in-chief he has as much right to make this demand as a highwayman has to ask for my purse." When Hutchinson threatened a humiliating search of the officer's baggage, Menu responded in strong terms of indignation, remonstrating against the injustice of the demands made upon him. "Jamais on a pillé le monde." Never has the world been so pillaged, even threatening a duel with Hutchinson. Clark noted, however, Colonel Turner soon brought this matter to a conclusion. The Rosetta tablet was taken from a warehouse covered with mats where it had been deposited with Menu's baggage, and it was surrendered to us by a French officer and member of the Institute in the streets of Alexandria, pointedly adding, Mr. Cripps, Mr. Hamilton, and the author being the only persons present to take possession of it. The officer appointed to deliver it recommended its speedy conveyance to some place of safety, as he could not be answerable for the conduct of the French soldiers if it was suffered to remain exposed to their indignation. Hutchinson ordered its immediate removal by Turner. But despite these dramatic events, Clark then visited the savants, where a scholarly urbanity prevailed, although they still refused to show him their map of Egypt. Clark's published report contradicts the testimony which Turner read to the Society of Antiquaries in 1810 and later published. Turner claimed that he alone collected the stone, and that when the French found the stone was to go to the British, they tore off its covering and it was thrown upon its face. With a detachment of artillerymen and an artillery engine called a devil cart, Turner carried off the stone from Menu's house to his own. Amid the sarcasms of numbers of French officers and men, During the time the stone had remained at my house, some gentlemen attached to the Corps of Savants requested to have a cast, which I readily granted, provided the stone should receive no injury, which cast they took to Paris, leaving the stone well cleared from the printing ink, which had been covered with, to take off several copies to send to France when it was first discovered. So with the rest of the antiquities loaded onto the Madras, Turner embarked with the Rosetta Stone, determining to share its fate on board the frigate Égyptienne, and arrived at Portsmouth in February 1802. The stone was sent to the Society of Antiquaries, where in July 4 plaster casts were taken and sent to the universities of Oxford, Cambridge, Edinburgh, and Dublin, and engravings of the Greek inscription distributed internationally. George III presented the stone and the other antiquities to the British Museum, where, being too heavy for the floors of the old museum, Montague House, they were temporarily housed under wooden sheds in the outer court. Have you got the picture of that? Yes. Until a new gallery, which you can see on the right, could be constructed. Early in its museum history, the Rosetta Stone's incised signs were filled in with white chalk to make the shallow text more legible to the public. And at some point, the two sides of the stone were painted with the words, "Captured in Egypt by the British Army 1801, and presented by King George III. Despite much later searching, the missing fragments of the stone, said to be worth their weight in diamonds, were never found. And of course, the stone would indeed prove to be the key to cracking the code of hieroglyphs. And I hope that you will be able to come to the exhibition Hieroglyphs Unlocking Ancient Egypt at the British Museum, where you'll find a much better description of decipherment itself than I can give you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia. What a wonderful window on those momentous events at the beginning of the 19th century. It's almost unfathomable, isn't it, how important the discovery of the Rosetta Stone was. I don't know about everybody else. It makes me slightly sort of unsettled to think about the circumstances in which it was discovered and the way that it eventually made its way out of Egypt. We have quite a lot of questions and not a lot of time left. But I think that's absolutely to be expected, really. We've had such interesting talks. I've been scribbling notes here myself, and I'm not remotely surprised that we've got as many questions as we have. I'm going to do my best to get through as many as I can before we hit our time limit. I'm going to go first to one for Patricia. Actually, just I think this probably allows us to refer back to the exhibition you just mentioned. Patricia, somebody is asking, can we see a copy of the Description de l'Égypte in the British Museum?
We've certainly got a copy in the archive. So it's not on show, but if you wanted to come and see the volumes, you could certainly make an appointment to come to the archive, and somebody would have to help me getting it down. It's they're on the upper shelves and they're absolutely incredibly heavy. Sorry. So it's in the exhibition. I beg your pardon. Alona's just told me that it's in the exhibition.
Yes, there is. Yes, there is. Isn't there a copy in there? Is that remind me? Is that a first edition or a second edition?
Ilona, is that a first edition or a second edition? A second edition.
A second edition. Okay. I was just happened to be in the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in Cairo just recently, and they have a copy. It's not a competition, but they have a copy of the first edition there, and it is absolutely enormous. I have no idea how anybody could ever be expected to move volumes like that.
By the way, there is one copy, Chris. There is one copy
yes.
also in the Egyptian Culture Centre in Audley Street in London.
Yes,
they probably can get in touch with the Culture Centre and visit it.
Yes, excellent. Yes, I would strongly encourage anybody who's interested to do that. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Okasha, we have a question here about whether or not there was a kind of a medieval equivalent almost of the Description de l'Égypte. What would you say was the closest thing? We often think of the Description de l'Égypte as being the first of the kind of monumental comprehensive surveys of sites and monuments. What would be the earlier medieval Arab equivalent to that?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I never thought about it. Well, the French Savant was a collection of eminent scholars and artists and engineers who produced such magnificent work. Nothing like this was organized in medieval Egypt, apart from the alchemical circles I mentioned earlier of Alchemist. I think Al-Idris's book on the pyramids is a very wide scope book. It just doesn't just cover the pyramids. It covers various archaeological sites around Egypt as well. He mentioned Karnak and Luxor. He mentioned sites near Helwan on the east bank of the river. Other groups like al-Baghdadi, Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi, for example, his book was a massive description of the landscape, geography, history, archaeology of Egypt. So I would say on a very limited scale, Abdul Latif Baghdadi al-Ifada wal-I'tibar, which is translated into English, is very similar in terms of the scope of covering in ancient and contemporary Egypt of his days. And he talks about fantastic artwork. He described the great temple of Ramessides in Memphis, and this huge statue, the colossal statues from Ramses II. And they wondered how on earth did the artist manage to keep this, the muscles of the king's legs are so beautifully and delicately done, and how did he manage to keep the harmony between the different parts of the statue of the Sphinx in Giza. So we think he's a great art historian as well, even though he's a medical doctor. He used to teach medicine and Arabic in Al-Azhar in Egypt, in Cairo, and then in his spare time visit archaeological sites and describe them. But what I like about him was he described both ancient Egypt and Egypt of his day. He described, of course, left us a vivid description of the famine that took place and lasted for 7 years in his days. So I think his book is the closest thing we come to the Description de l'Égypte, but on a very different scale. This is one man show. The French is a group of organized scholars, funded, of course, massively by the state, as it were.
And that actually leads me quite nicely to another question, which perhaps is one for Patricia. The Napoleonic expedition, of course, represents, as Okasha says, this great sort of moment where you've got a military expedition arriving in Egypt, okay, with military, political, economic purposes, but they bring with them the savants. The question here is, to what extent did the local people in Egypt assist the savants, or how were they received by the local Egyptian population?
Well, I think there was great opposition to Napoleon in Cairo, and the savants had to make their way really following in with the army, going to sites wherever they could, making their copies, doing their drawings, doing their work. So I assume they must have, asked local people in order to find the things that they wanted. And it is such an extensive work, which describes all the temples, and not every single inscription is accurate, but it attempted to copy all the inscriptions as well.
I seem to remember Denon in his popular account occasionally talks about, almost describes bullets whistling past the heads.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, he was under fire. Yes, I was going to say that. Yes, so they were working in terrible conditions when they could, under the cover of the army, and then when they had to move on, they had to just move on very quickly. So it's quite astonishing when you see the books what they managed to achieve. It's incredible.
Yes, it is, isn't it? It's interesting to reflect. Actually, I thought there was something in your talk that just made me think it's quite a striking point, that both the Description, which we do think of as this great sort of monumental publication, it's the first of a series, we should say, of attempts at creating comprehensive survey. Slightly later on, we have people like Robert Hay, who never published his survey, but he made that attempt. Carl Richard Lepsius in the 1840s subsequently publishes a fabulous survey. But of course, the Napoleonic savants it's fascinating to see in your talk how aware they were of the importance of the decipherment. That came out in both of your papers, I thought. And we have a question here, actually, just thinking about sort of different purposes for deciphering hieroglyphs. For Okasha, did the alchemists believe that hieroglyphs would assist them not in perhaps understanding so much about ancient Egyptian history, but in their work, in alchemical work, in creating gold? Did they think that hieroglyphs were a part of that?
Yes, indeed. They even were well aware. Why were the temples important for them? Because they were well aware that the temples included workshops where the golden and silver materials used for the service, the cups and all sorts of other things. If you take the Temple of Dandara, for example, we do have indeed around the Holy of the Holies a shrine, one of the side rooms, were depicted on the walls, and the same thing with the Temple of Edfu, prescriptions of golden materials used in the temple, and we have this famous room in Edfu where medical prescriptions are included in the inscriptions. So the good thing about this alchemist, they thought that by visiting one of those shrines or several of these shrines and studying the hieroglyphic on the walls, you might strike gold, because you might come across a secret recipe that tells you how to transfer or transmit gold or materials into gold, or come with some fantastic chemical transformations. So it is true that we know that some of these workshops to produce gold and things were actually included and within the sites of the temples, especially of the Greek Roman temples. So their assumption wasn't far-fetched in light of our knowledge now of ancient Egyptian temple functions.
I think it's just absolutely fascinating to think about. Of course, we're focusing on the language here, but also some other aspects of the inquiries of the medieval scholars, as you say, speak to what we now can see from archaeological and other evidence was genuinely what was happening in ancient Egypt. Folks, we were given a very hard deadline for this discussion, and I think we are at the end. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of the questions, but well, hopefully you've got plenty to go away and do as your homework following this session. You've got a few books to read, an exhibition to go and see as well. It just remains for me to say a big thank you to everybody involved in this session. I have thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm very sorry that we weren't able to bring Professor Ola Alaguzi into the discussions, but as you'll see, we've had plenty to talk about anyway. Perhaps there'll be a chance for us to get Professor Ola back at some point in future. Big thank you to Hilary and to Simon behind the scenes for putting all of this together and assisting us technically. And the biggest thank you of all, of course, to our speakers today, Dr. Okasha Daly and Dr. Patricia Usick, for their fabulous talks. Online events are not quite the same as in-person events. This would be the moment for an absolutely thunderous round of applause for them both. You out there in the ether, perhaps if you could, I don't know, click your mouse buttons or press your space bars or just applaud back at home, that would be entirely appropriate. And Okasha and Patricia will just have to imagine that huge wave of applause that's coming at you.
Thank you.
There will be further events in this series. The next one coming up is going to be called Tutankhamun Reimagined, a Conversation, and that takes place very shortly on the 8th of December. All the information you need will be on the British Museum website. Hope to see you there for that one. And in the meantime, again, thank you to all of our speakers, to everybody behind the scenes, and thank you to all of you out there at home for joining us today. Hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Thank you, and see you next time.
Bye-bye. Thank you.